Hello, Mzansi. Welcome to Farmers Inside Track, proudly brought to you by Food for Mzansi. I'm your host, Patricia Tembo. Welcome to episode 517. So today we're looking at sorghum farming. Sorghum is a climate-resilient indigenous crop with an impressive nutritious value. This episode is set to be informative and practical as we welcome Hammond Motsi, who is an agronomist and PhD researcher. He will unpack how you can get started with farming sorghum and why it is a great option. Hammond Motsi, welcome once again to Farmers Inside Track. We're excited to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So Hammond, you are an agronomist and PhD researcher. But for our listeners who may not know you or who haven't heard of you, could you please share a little bit more about the work and research that you are doing in the field?
I am from Zimbabwe, but I have been studying my tertiary education in South Africa, starting from University of Fort Hare, where I did my undergraduate and honors in crop science and soil science. And then I moved for the postgrad to Stellenbosch University, where I did my master's in agronomy. That's where I had an opportunity to have sorghum or a sweet sorghum as part of my research project. And then currently I'm now doing my PhD in soil science, a bit drifting away from the agronomy part, but it's a very interesting topic.
You know, you're the perfect person to speak to on today's topic, which will be discussing sorghum and in a more practical way and how farmers can look to adopting the crop in their production. And I know the word that our farmers might be more familiar with is mabele, the sorghum meal, but there's so much more to this crop, which we'll get into. And we have covered quite a bit about it and how it's a climate resilient crop and the nutritious benefits that it offers. Maybe give us a brief overview of sorghum as a crop and its significance in South Africa's agriculture.
Initially, let me start by saying that there are three types of sorghum. There is grain sorghum, which is the one people dominantly knows. There is forage sorghum, which is normally used for feeding animals. And then there is sweet sorghum. So sweet sorghum is got sweet stalks, just like sugarcane, and it can also produce grain. So it's also called a multi-purpose crop. Those are the three types of sweet sorghum. So in South Africa, there is still low production of sorghum, both on small scale and on the commercial level. Some of the statistics are that about 130 to 150 hectares under sorghum production annually, which produces something like 100 to 180 tons annually in South Africa. And then some of the major regions where sorghum is produced, starting with the commercial ones, the Free State and Mpumalanga. And then for the small scale farmers, it's mostly in rural areas of KwaZulu-Natal, Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and Northwest Province. Sorghum has got a lot of significance in South Africa, which includes, of course, firstly, the food security. We need food and it produces the starchy or the carbohydrate part of the food, which can replace other conventional crops like maize. So it also has some health benefits, and recently there's been rise on the preference of food people eat in terms of what is in the food. For instance, people are running away from food which contains gluten and they are seeking for gluten-free food. And sorghum is one of the crop which has gluten-free seeds. So that's other importance of sorghum in South Africa. Another one is the cultural significance. We know like people in rural areas, they normally use it for cooking that traditional beer. It's one of the cultural significance of sorghum. And then, of course, the economic significance. It fetches some better prices than the conventional crops like sorghum. And then lastly, the agronomic advantages. It has lots of advantages such as climate resilience, low input costs, and so forth.
And you mentioned some of the provinces where sorghum production is happening on a larger scale. I think Free State and Mpumalanga are the ones that you mentioned first. Is it due to the specific regions what sort of climate is suitable for producing sorghum?
The main factor why those two provinces are the major producers is because the sorghum that side is commercialized. So that's why they are the most productive ones. And then when it comes to the issue of climate, sorghum, it actually needs some hot climate and it's a C4 crop. So due to that, it can tolerate such high temperatures or medium to high temperatures. And then it also needs some rainfall, although it doesn't need much.
And when you refer to C4, just for our farmers listening, with technical terms, just to unpack them a bit, C4 is the way it fixes carbon. Is that correct? Maybe if you can just elaborate a little bit more on why it being C4 is significant to where it is grown.
So C4 is a scientific term. If you remember photosynthesis, that's where it comes from. So there are three types of plants according to the way they do photosynthesis. There's the C3, which are about 94% of the plants, and then there are C4, which are about 4 or 5%, and then there are CAM plants or CAM. So the C4 have greater advantages than the C3 because they can maximize their photosynthesis even under low water conditions and high carbon dioxide concentration. So currently, as we are worrying about climate change, that's why they are being advised because they are resilient to the current climate conditions. And this makes sorghum more a second crop in the climate resilient.
Looking at the provinces in Mpumalanga, Free State is where sorghum production is more commercialized. What varieties are those being cultivated in the area? For our farmers listening, wanting to get into sorghum production, you did mention that you get grain sorghum, you get the sweet sorghum. But maybe you can speak a little bit more about the varieties available and the one that is most marketable.
So the three types, the most grown, like what I've said, is the grain sorghum. And there are a variety of the varieties. There are a lot of them. And they are dependent on the area or the scientists who are evaluating them. So I don't have the specific names, but they are there. If you go when you're buying the seeds, those agronomists who are selling can advise you on what kind of variety you may grow, depending on the climate, the fertilizer you are growing, and so forth. So it's not something which is difficult when it comes to the varieties. The agronomists can assist you, especially when you're buying the seed.
And maybe we can look a bit on the crop itself and its cycle. When is the most ideal time to plant and harvest sorghum?
Sorghum, it's a summer crop, which means that you have to plant it around October, November, December. In fact, those are the months which are advised to be planted when it comes to South Africa. So depending on the variety or on the type, it grows for about 4 to 6 months. And then after that, that's when you harvest. So if you plant in October, depending on the variety, let's say it's a 4-month variety, it means that you harvest around February or March. And then if you plant a bit later in December, you also have to harvest it maybe around April, May later on.
So we spoke about the ideal time to plant and when harvest typically takes place for the sorghum plant. But I'm curious to know how this grain compares to what we know as Africa's staple grain, which is maize, in terms of in the input requirements and yield. We're stuck on maize. It's what we know. But if you can maybe compare the two in terms of the yield and the input that is required.
There are a lot of difference between maize and the sorghum. And in fact, maize is staple food for Africa as well as sorghum. And if you go to other parts of Africa, like West Africa, sorghum is actually more familiar than maize. So it's actually mainly here in the southern part of Africa and probably some parts of the central and eastern parts. So firstly, the sorghum has got low production cost than maize. And this becomes important specifically for smallholder farmers who are resource poor. So maize requires a lot of fertilizer, a lot of water and so forth. Another issue is the issue of drought resistant, like what we have said at the glance. maize is not drought resistant, which is the reason why we are having a lot of food security problems, specifically here in the Southern Africa region, because we are dominantly producing maize. These current climatic harsh conditions, whereas sorghum can be resilient in such conditions. Another advantage is that sorghum can be used for several purposes. If you remember, I mentioned about the sweet sorghum. So the sweet sorghum can be used as food if you utilize the grains. And then the sweet stalks can be used for sugar production as well as the biofuels. So again, there is a current rush from running away from fossil fuels and then preferring fuels which are green, and then the biofuels are one of them. So it can be used for that, which is one of the major production. And then this makes sorghum also to have alternative income streams since it's used for several purposes than maize.
It's quite interesting, as farmers would probably consider sorghum as a crop to diversify with, that it goes even further than just sorghum, but it can be used for, as you mentioned, biofuels and sugar production. Mentioning that maize is not drought resistant, I'm curious to know, because they are both C4 plants, supposed to be more heat tolerant. Why is it that maize has a lower threshold for heat than sorghum does?
It's generally the genetics part of it. So each and every plant has got its own genetics. So sorghum, it's actually adapted to those harsh conditions. That's how its genetics is, whereas maize is not. So these plants like sorghum have been grown here in Africa like for thousands of years, whereas maize was introduced about 100 to 200 years ago, and it wasn't originated from here. So that's where they differ, although they are both C4 crops.
Your profession as an agronomist, what considerations do farmers then need before they are considering cultivating sorghum on their fields? Maybe if you could just give some pointers in terms of the agronomic factors that need to be considered to see, I suppose, successful sorghum production.
That's the most important part of farming, the key agronomic factors, very, very important. And then generally what farmers need to consider when it comes to other crops, they also need to consider it when it comes to sorghum, such as variety selection. The farmer needs to know what kind of variety they are choosing or they need to choose depending on the type of soil they have, the climate conditions where they're going to plant, as well as the fertilizer application they're going to apply. Another factor they have to consider is soil preparation. The soil need to be properly prepared such that there will be no challenges when it comes to the germination of the seeds. They also need to consider the pests, diseases, and weeds. Each and every plant is affected with these issues, and farmers need to know what kind of pests, diseases, and weeds they expect and how they can deal with them. And then, of course, they also need to know about the fertilizer application. They have to follow the 4R stewardship, which is the philosophy of fertilizer application in terms of its rate, type.
You now briefly went over one of the factors, which is pests, diseases, and weeds that the sorghum plant is susceptible to. Looking at that, what do farmers need to be aware of, or what pests, diseases, weeds are associated with sorghum production?
Pests and diseases are actually a problem, and sorghum is not immune to them. So some of the major diseases sorghum is affected with include the sorghum midge. It affects the leaves and the stems, the leaf blight. It also affects the leaves, and then the smut. It's like a virus also which affects the leaves. So the major diseases are actually on the leaves, and then there are some which are also affect the grains, but not dominantly. And then when it comes to the pests, the major problem is the stalk borer. So that one affects the stem, and then it goes straight to the heart of the plant, and then it kills it. So farmers need to be aware of that. And then there's also aphids, which normally affects the leaves as well as the shoot fly. So farmers need to know these kind of diseases and others, and then how to deal with them if they affect their crop.
You mentioned one of the factors being the 4R stewardship rate. I did a quick search to see what the 4 R's are. And I'm seeing that it is the right source, right rate, right time, right place. Just for our farmers listening, the 4R stewardship when it comes to fertilizer application. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And I'm assuming this is to avoid situations where you find that there's over application of fertilizer or dependence on fertilizer, which, leads to like soil pollution, eutrophication, things like that. So it's great that you mentioned that. Looking at maybe the more financial aspect of producing sorghum compared to other conventional crops farmers are used to, what are the financial risks and benefits that you would associate with sorghum?
The benefits, of course, the low input costs, right? So you don't need to apply a lot of fertilizer. You don't need to apply a lot of water. And even when you are dealing with pests and diseases, it's better in sorghum than how it is in conventional crops. So that's one of the most financial benefits. And then the other financial benefits, like what I've said, is that sorghum has a lot of alternative uses, which means that there are a lot of alternative income streams a farmer can get from compared to the conventional crops.
Looking at the markets in South Africa, we did speak a little bit about the cultivation of sorghum being commercialized in Free State, Mpumalanga. But what does the informal market look like for sorghum?
It's mainly about beer, based on that traditional beer. But some people, they are incorporating it in terms of using it like pulp and porridge and so forth. The market is actually growing that side. And then even on the formal market, you find out that now SAB, the one for beer making, they are actually now considering sorghum as an alternative for barley, which is conventionally used for beer making. So for the past 3-4 years, there have been a lot of agronomic trials which are taking place such that they can try to cultivate the sorghum, which is tailored for beer making. The market looks good both for formal and informal sectors.
Good to hear that it's growing in that way as well. And with the research that you've done, you've worked with quite a few sorghum farmers. What have you observed in terms of the way these farmers are tapping into high value markets? How have you seen sorghum being a viable option for farmers?
As a result of its advantages like environmental, agronomic, economic, and so forth, farmers are actually finding it very valuable, and as well as the awareness to them. Some they didn't know about it, and then there's been a lot of awareness through the Ministry of Agriculture, and then as well as Grain SA. It's also playing a role on the awareness for the farmers to grow them.
There's actually a whole campaign that Grain SA is running on sorghum, which is quite interesting. Mentioning farmers and, how sorghum is a viable option to diversify into as well. What advice would you give to a new farmer who is considering sorghum production? What do they need to be aware of? You mentioned factors, but maybe looking at a bigger picture, the whole picture, what advice would you give to a farmer considering starting sorghum production? Maybe if you can differentiate a small scale farmer and what is important for them to consider, and then maybe commercial farmers who want to diversify their production, what they need to consider as well.
So for commercial farmers, it's easy for them because the major issue when it comes to agriculture is all about market. So for marketing in terms of the commercial farmers, it's very easy. And then when it comes to smallholder farmers, there's a lot of factors they actually need to consider before they start in sorghum. So they have to know the kind of varieties they can use, like what I've mentioned before, as well as how to produce it. And then they have to link up with extension support for training. The Department of Agriculture, I think they do have trainings and a lot of information they can advise these farmers. And then, of course, the market, they also need to know how they can access the market such that even after they properly grow their sorghum, they don't struggle with marketing it.
Are there other avenues that you perhaps are aware of for farmers to use, or resources, maybe yourself as a resource for farmers who are wanting to get into sorghum production?
I think internet is the source. Yeah, there's a lot of information and knowledge farmers can learn from internet. And then even some of these platforms, there are a lot of platforms like consultation agriculture platforms where they can reach out and then they can communicate to them on how they can grow the sorghum.
I suppose to close off this episode, if you'd speak a little bit more about the research that you are currently busy with. Is it with sorghum?
No, it's actually a very important topic. My current topic is mainly on soil, and then I'm looking on how soils can help in fight for climate change. So I have a site in Eastern Cape where you found a biome known as the Spekboom biome. It's just a kind of forest which is a bit unique. So there's a lot of uniqueness with that biome. It fixes a lot of carbon in the soil. And then depending on the kind of climate you found that site, which is less than 300 millimeters of rainfall, and then at high temperatures over 30, you can't expect that high amount of carbon. So I'm just looking at what are the mechanisms, why is that it fits such amount of carbon regarding the kind of climate which is found there. It's something which is more on climate, on soil, and then it's not mainly agronomic, but my master's and my previous undergrad, they were more of agronomic projects.
Yes, you did do your MSc on sorghum, part of your research. Maybe you can speak a little bit more on what the outcomes were with the research that you did on this crop.
So on my MSc, I actually did sweet sorghum, which I mentioned that it's a multi-purpose crop. Yeah. So what I did was I was using different inorganic fertilizers, and this research was actually dedicated to smallholder farmers because a lot of them, they don't afford this inorganic fertilizer. So I was using organic fertilizer. Yeah. So what I had was manure and then biochar and then crow manure. So the other manure was like the cow dung manure, and then the crow was a mixture. And then biochar is an organic material which is made by compressing any organic material like crop residues or even manure or tree residues at high temperatures. And then the outcome of it is called a black carbon compound. So I had the crow manure, the biochar, and then the mixture of all. So I evaluated the yield in terms of the grain yield, the biomass yield, and also the biofuel yield, which is the sugars in the stocks. My results generally showed that the mixture of biochar and manure or biochar and crow manure yielded the most yield on both all the parameters which I evaluated.
Thank you so much to Hammond Motsi, who is a PhD researcher and agronomist. Of course, you can read more about this topic on www.foodformzansi.co.za. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. From me, Patricia Tembo, our technical producer, Megan van der Vent, and the rest of #team Food for Mzansi, thank you for listening.